The neighborhood of Cedar Hollow Estates looked like the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong on the surface. Manicured lawns stretched evenly from house to house. Mailboxes were identical. Even the trees seemed trimmed with obsessive precision, as if the entire street lived under an invisible measuring tape. The HOA prided itself on community harmony, though most residents quietly understood it meant strict rules and even stricter enforcement. At the far end of the street stood a slightly older home than the rest, brickwork faded by time but still solid. It belonged to Thomas "Tom" Reeve, a 72-year-old retired Marine. He didn't stand out in flashy ways. No luxury car, no loud decorations, no attempt to modernize beyond necessity. Just a calm, steady presence that made neighbors nod respectfully when they passed. Tom had lived there longer than most of them had been alive in the neighborhood. What people didn't talk about openly, because few actually knew the full truth, was that Tom had been around since the earliest days of Cedar Hollow's development. Back when the land was still being divided, contracts signed in small offices, and the neighborhood existed more on paper than reality. He never spoke about it, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. To him, the house wasn't a status symbol, it was simply home. Most mornings, Tom could be seen on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the world wake up in slow rhythm. He would sometimes nod at passing neighbors, occasionally exchange a short greeting, but never linger too long in conversation. There was a quiet discipline about him, something that came from years of structure, command, and understanding exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. That silence, however, was often mistaken for harmlessness. On a warm Thursday afternoon, that sense of routine was interrupted. A moving truck turned onto Cedar Hollow Drive. It was large, modern, and polished, far too expensive for the modest suburban setting. The engine purred smoothly as it rolled forward, followed by a black sports car that looked like it belonged in a city skyline rather than a quiet residential street. Tom noticed immediately. Not because he was curious, but because he always noticed changes in patterns. It was a habit drilled into him long before retirement. The truck stopped in front of the house directly next to his. The property had been empty for weeks. A for sale sign had recently vanished, and there had been rumors about a buyer, but nothing confirmed. Now, confirmation arrived in the form of noise, movement, and a young man stepping out of the black car like he owned the entire block. He was in his late 20s or early 30s, sharply dressed in expensive casual wear, designer sneakers, fitted jeans, and sunglasses that didn't need to be worn but clearly were for effect. He looked around with an expression that mixed boredom and judgment, as if the neighborhood itself was beneath him. This was Evan Carter. Even before he spoke to anyone, he radiated the kind of confidence that came not from experience, but from money and assumption. The movers began unloading as Evan checked his phone, barely acknowledging the world around him. One of the trucks rolled slightly too far forward, edging close to Tom's driveway. Tom noticed. He stood up from his porch slowly, setting down his coffee cup with care. The driveway was his boundary line, simple, respected, unspoken. But before he could even take a step, Evan's voice cut through the air. "Hey, don't worry about that space," Evan said without looking up. "We'll be here for a bit, it's fine." Tom paused. That was the first moment something subtle shifted in the air. Not anger yet, not conflict. Just recognition. Because Evan hadn't asked, he hadn't checked, he hadn't even looked at him properly. He had simply assumed. And in Cedar Hollow Estates, assumptions were often where trouble began. Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, not in hostility, but in observation. Years of discipline told him something simple. People who don't respect boundaries usually test them first. And this one had just taken his first step. Inside the moving truck, boxes continued to shift. Outside, the street remained quiet. But underneath that quiet, something was beginning to stir. And Tom Reeve, still standing on his porch, already understood one thing clearly. This new neighbor wasn't just moving in. He was about to make the whole street move differently. By the time the sun dipped lower over Cedar Hollow Estates, Evan Carter had already begun reshaping the street in his own image, whether anyone agreed to it or not. The movers worked quickly but not carefully enough for Evan's liking. He snapped instructions constantly, packing back and forth with his phone pressed to his ear, talking about deadlines, acquisitions, and some startup deal that sounded more important than the neighborhood he had just moved into. To him, this wasn't a home, it was a temporary asset. And assets in Evan's world didn't get questioned. That mindset became obvious within the first hour. A delivery van arrived with furniture. Instead of pulling fully into his driveway, it stopped diagonally across the curb, partially spilling into the shared roadway. Evan didn't seem to notice or care. Tom Reeves, still on his porch, observed quietly. He didn't interfere, not yet. He had seen men like Evan before, confident, loud in their assumptions, convinced that inconvenience only applied to other people. Experience had taught Tom something important. People like this rarely respond to correction. They respond to consequences. Still, there were limits. When Evan's sleek black sports car settled awkwardly across the curb line, its rear end partially blocking Tom's driveway, the boundary was no longer theoretical. It was physical. Tom stood again. Not quickly, not aggressively, just deliberately. He walked across his yard with steady steps, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. Evan was standing near the movers, laughing at something on his phone when Tom approached. "Your car's blocking my driveway," Tom said calmly. Evan didn't even turn fully around. He raised one hand slightly, still focused on his screen. "It's temporary," he replied. "We're unloading, chill for like 5 minutes." Tom looked at the car again, then back at Evan. "There's a curb space 2 houses down," he said. "It's empty." Now Evan finally looked at him, but only briefly. The expression on his face wasn't anger, it was something worse, dismissal. "You live here?" Evan asked, as if confirming Tom's relevance. "Yes," Tom said simply. A short pause followed, filled only by the sound of boxes being moved and the distant hum of suburban quiet. Evan gave a small amused smile. "Cool, then you'll understand this is just how moves work. Don't make it weird, all right." And just like that, he turned away. The conversation was over in his mind. But for Tom, it wasn't a conversation. It was a measurement of character. That evening, the street began to notice Evan in ways Tom already had. He played music from his phone too loudly while supervising furniture being carried in. He left boxes in the shared walkway, assuming others would step around them. At one point, he even told a neighbor that HOA rules were kind of flexible depending on the situation, which made the older residents exchange uneasy glances. By nightfall, frustration had begun to settle quietly across Cedar Hollow. And then came the envelope. A thin, official-looking notice was placed neatly at Evan's front door by the HOA compliance officer. Tom saw it from his porch but said nothing. Evan noticed it almost immediately when he returned from ordering takeout. He picked it up, glanced at it, and laughed. A short, dismissive sound. "What is this HOA drama already?" he muttered. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he tossed it on his kitchen counter like junk mail and continued scrolling through his phone, already distracted by something far more important in his mind. From across the street, Tom watched the light in Evan's kitchen glow. He didn't smile, he didn't react. But something subtle had changed in his posture. Not tension. Preparation. Because Tom had seen that reaction before too, men who laugh at consequences they haven't understood yet. And in his experience, those were always the ones who learned the hardest lessons. Inside Evan's house, the unopened HOA notice sat untouched on the counter. Outside, the street remained calm. But beneath that calm, the first real crack in the conflict had formed. And neither of them knew it yet, but that single ignored envelope was about to become the least important piece of paper in the entire story. By the third morning in Cedar Hollow Estates, Evan Carter had fully settled into a dangerous rhythm. Ignore, override, repeat. The HOA notice still sat unopened on his kitchen counter, now partially buried under coffee cups, delivery receipts, and a laptop running non-stop notifications. To Evan, paperwork was background noise, something people without leverage worried about. Outside, however, the neighborhood had started to notice a pattern forming. His car remained a constant issue. Sometimes it was angled across the curb for convenience. Other times it was left idling while deliveries came and went. Once it had blocked a neighbor's mailbox for nearly an hour, causing quiet frustration that no one openly voiced, but everyone remembered. Tom Reeve observed all of it from his porch without commentary. He wasn't reacting emotionally, he was collecting information. Years in the Marines had taught him something simple: chaos doesn't begin with explosions, it begins with ignored boundaries. And Evan was ignoring a lot of them. By the end of the week, the HOA issued a formal summons for the monthly board meeting. Attendance was usually low, mostly older residents discussing landscaping rules or parking compliance updates. But this time, the atmosphere felt different. People showed up early. And so did Evan. He arrived wearing the same effortless confidence as before, dressed casually but expensively, as if the meeting itself was beneath him. He entered the community hall late, phone in hand, not bothering to acknowledge the stares from the room. Tom was already seated near the back, quiet, still observing. The HOA president began with routine matters, but it didn't take long before Evan was called out directly. "Mr. Carter," the president said carefully, adjusting her glasses, "we've received multiple reports regarding parking violations, obstruction of shared access points, and disregard for posted community guidelines." A few heads turned. Evan finally looked up and smiled. Not nervously, but amused. "Oh, that," he said lightly, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I saw the notice. Honestly, I think there's a misunderstanding." A murmur passed through the room. He continued before anyone could respond. "I just moved in. Things are chaotic. Movers, deliveries, startup calls, you know how it is. I'm sure this is just temporary friction." The way he said it wasn't apologetic, it was explanatory, like he was educating them. The HOA president tried to maintain composure. "Even temporary issues still fall under compliance," she said. "We expect residents to respect shared access and—" Evan raised a hand, slightly interrupting. "Look," he said, "I respect structure, I really do, but some of these rules feel outdated. A lot of unnecessary rigidity for a modern community." That word, rigidity, hung in the air longer than intended. A few older residents shifted uncomfortably. Then Evan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound persuasive rather than loud. "I mean, we're not talking about serious issues here. It's parking, it's curb space. Let's not turn small inconveniences into bureaucracy wars." A couple of younger members looked uncertain. The HOA president hesitated. That was the moment Evan felt in control. And then Tom spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just clearly. "You're assuming inconvenience is the same as permission." The room went quiet. Every head turned slightly, not because Tom had interrupted loudly, but because he rarely spoke at all. Evan looked toward the back of the room, finally focusing on him properly for the first time. There was a brief pause. Then Evan smiled again, softer this time, but sharper underneath. "Sir," he said, "no offense, but I think you're taking this a bit personally." Tom didn't react to the comment. He simply met his gaze. "I'm taking it correctly," he said. The silence that followed was heavier this time. Even the HOA president didn't immediately step in. Evan exhaled through his nose, as if mildly entertained. "All right," he said, standing slightly. "Let's just agree we're all neighbors trying to figure things out." But as he gathered his things, he added one final remark, almost casually. "I'm sure once people adjust to the new standard of living here, these issues will sort themselves out." That sentence lingered longer than anything else said in the meeting. Not because it was loud, but because it revealed intent. Outside, as the meeting eventually dissolved into uneasy conversation, Tom remained seated for a moment longer than everyone else. His expression didn't change. But internally, something had shifted. Evan wasn't just careless. He was convinced he belonged in control. And people like that didn't usually stop on their own. As Tom finally stood to leave, he glanced once toward the parking lot. Evan's car was there again, half a foot over a line that didn't belong to him. And for the first time, Tom didn't just observe it. He remembered it. The tension in Cedar Hollow Estates didn't explode all at once. It tightened slowly, like a wire being pulled too far for too long. By the weekend, Evan Carter had stopped pretending to adjust to the neighborhood. He had started reshaping it. Music played louder from his house. Delivery trucks came and went at odd hours. And most noticeably, his black sports car had become a constant presence in the worst possible positions, half on curbs, angled across shared space, and once again drifting dangerously close to Tom Reeves' driveway. Neighbors no longer whispered, they exchanged looks. And Tom, he still said very little. But he watched everything. That Saturday afternoon, the situation finally crossed a line no one could ignore. Tom returned home after a short trip to pick up supplies. As he turned into his driveway, he slowed instinctively. Evan's car was there. Not partially blocking this time. Completely blocking it. Perfectly centered across the entrance, as if it had been placed there intentionally, not out of carelessness, but out of statement. Tom stopped the car he was driving at the curb and sat for a moment. No reaction on his face, no visible frustration. Just recognition. This wasn't inconvenience anymore. This was provocation. Across the street, Evan was outside, leaning against his porch railing, talking on his phone loudly, laughing at something someone said on the other end. He didn't even look toward Tom's driveway. He didn't need to. In his mind, the space was temporary, everything was temporary. Rules, boundaries, complaints, they all bent eventually. Tom stepped out of his car. He didn't slam the door, he didn't march across the street. He walked normally. Each step steady, controlled. Evan noticed him only when he was already halfway across the yard. "Hey," Tom said once he reached the edge of the driveway. Evan lowered his phone slightly, still smiling. "Is up? My driveway is blocked." Evan glanced back at his car as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh yeah," he said casually. "Someone was in my spot earlier, I just parked there for a minute." Tom waited. A full second passed. Then another. Evan continued shrugging. "I'll move it in a bit, I've got a call right now." And just like that, he lifted the phone back to his ear. Turned away. Dismissal without effort. That was the moment something in the air changed, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. Tom didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply said, "Move it." Evan paused mid-sentence on his call. Then he lowered the phone again, slowly this time. A faint smile returned, but thinner now. "Or what?" he asked lightly. It wasn't curiosity. It was challenge. Behind them, a couple of neighbors had started to watch from their windows. No one intervened, no one spoke, but everyone felt the shift. Tom's gaze stayed steady. "There's no or," he said. "You're blocking access to private property." Evan laughed once, short and sharp. "Dude, it's a driveway, relax, nobody's dying here." That sentence landed heavier than intended. Because it revealed exactly how little Evan understood about boundaries that weren't his to define. Tom exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he nodded once. Not in agreement. Indecision. Without another word, he turned and walked back toward his house. Evan watched him go, amused again, already assuming the conversation had ended in his favor. "Yeah, that's what I thought," he muttered, turning back to his phone. But Tom wasn't done. Inside his house, he didn't rush, he didn't fume. He walked directly to a small, locked cabinet in his office, the one he rarely opened unless necessary. He paused in front of it for a moment, then unlocked it. Inside were documents, old, carefully preserved, sealed records that most people in the neighborhood had never seen and never questioned. Tom placed them on his desk. One folder. One truth. And as he slowly opened it, his expression remained calm, but now carried something different beneath it. Not anger. Certainty. Outside, Evan's car still blocked the driveway. Inside, Tom was no longer debating what to do. He was confirming what had already been decided long ago. And for the first time since Evan Carter arrived in Cedar Hollow Estates, the situation was no longer about parking. It was about ownership. The HOA community hall had never felt this tense. What was usually a quiet, half-empty room for discussing landscaping fees and mailbox paint regulations now felt like a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Even people who normally avoided meetings were here. Because word had spread. Tom Reeve had called for an emergency review session, and that alone was unusual enough to draw attention. He never challenged the HOA system. He rarely attended unless required. So when he requested this meeting personally, people understood something serious was coming. Evan Carter arrived late again. Same confident stride, same expensive casual outfit, same expression that suggested he still believed this was all beneath him. He didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he leaned against a wall near the back, scrolling his phone, only half paying attention as the meeting began. Tom was already seated at the front table. A single folder sat in front of him. Old, slightly worn, bound with careful precision. The HOA president cleared her throat. Mr. Reeve has requested this session to present documentation regarding a property dispute concern. Evan looked up briefly at the word dispute and smirked. Property dispute, he muttered under his breath, over a driveway. Tom didn't react. He simply opened the folder. The room quieted instantly. Inside were original land allocation documents, yellowed but preserved, survey maps, developer signatures, transfer records dating back decades, carefully stamped approvals from the earliest phase of Cedar Hollow Estates construction. Tom placed the first page on the table. This, he said calmly, is the original parcel division agreement for this section of Cedar Hollow. A few people leaned forward. Evan rolled his eyes slightly. Tom continued, placing another document on top. And this, he added, is the recorded assignment of secondary parcels tied to Lot 17 and adjacent access pathways. The room shifted. Evan stopped scrolling his phone. Not fully engaged yet, but less amused now. The HOA president adjusted her glasses and leaned closer. Tom finally turned one page over slowly and tapped a specific section. This includes legal access control over driveway ingress and shared curb allocation for this property line. Silence. Then Evan laughed softly. Okay, he said, finally pushing off the wall. Let me guess, you're saying you own the street or something. A few nervous chuckles came from the room. But Tom didn't look at him. He turned another page. No, he said simply, I'm saying I never gave it up. That sentence changed the atmosphere instantly. The room felt tighter. He slid the document forward. The HOA president read silently, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. This indicates retained rights over portions of the original access design, she said slowly, including driveway ingress easements. Evan's smile faded just slightly. That's not possible, he said quickly. This is a neighborhood HOA-managed development. Everything gets transferred. Tom finally looked at him. And for the first time, there was something firm behind his calm. It didn't, he said. A pause. Then he added, because I never signed the final relinquishment when the development company split assets. The room went completely silent. Even the air felt different now. Evan's expression tightened. That's outdated paperwork, he said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Even if that's real, it wouldn't matter today. Nobody enforces something from decades ago. The HOA president spoke carefully. If these documents are valid and unchallenged, they may still hold legal standing. That was the moment Evan's posture changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Tom closed the folder gently. I wasn't enforcing anything, he said, until my driveway was blocked. Evan scoffed again, but it sounded weaker now. This is insane, he muttered. You're seriously escalating over parking. Tom stood slowly. And for the first time, the room went completely still, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't need to. I'm not escalating, he said, I'm correcting. He placed the folder down, then added quietly, you parked on land you don't have the authority to block. That sentence landed like a weight dropping in the room. Evan looked around briefly, waiting for someone to dismiss it, to laugh, to back him up. But no one did. For the first time since he arrived in Cedar Hollow Estates, Evan Carter wasn't the center of control. He was the subject of it. And he could feel it slipping. Slowly. Uncomfortably. Unavoidably. Tom gathered the folder and stepped back. Not in triumph. Not in anger. Just certainty. And as he turned to leave the room, one final truth lingered behind him. Evan's confidence hadn't just been challenged. It had been documented and verified. And now, for the first time, Evan understood something he hadn't considered before. He might not actually be in charge of the ground he was standing on.